Hi there, I'm James Wisser from Acid Yellow, and in this video I'm going to look at the beginnings of customizing code underneath a generated IronSpeed application. The first steps into customizing the code underneath your IronSpeed application can be a slightly frightening one. There's an awful lot to be aware of and learn and understand about the way that the code underneath your application fits together, the way that it operates. And you'll certainly be moving more into the sort of wider .NET space and will require to have a certain degree of understanding of the .NET page lifecycle before you're going to be able to successfully customize your code. However, the good news is that Designer can do an awful lot to help you to get to that stage and to find the correct code methods that you want to modify to achieve the customizations that you're looking for. So let's have a little bit of a look around the structure of Designer and how Designer attempts to make it more simple for you to find the code that you're looking for and to understand where to put your customizations. So here I've got a simple IronSpeed application which I've put together using the Southwind database that comes with the product. And over on the left-hand side here, you can see my Application Explorer window. And if I collapse up the top node there, you'll see there are 4 main nodes in this tree view, and these are designed to reflect the tiers of the N-tier structure of your application. At the bottom layer there are the base classes, which you can pop open that node and have a look at the code within there. Although you can see the code that's within the base classes here, for example, if I were to go into the data area and look at base table, for example, I can see code that exists within the base classes.data namespace. However, I can't actually modify any of this code. Base classes code is maintained in a separate project, the DLL of which is copied into your application as a reference. So this code is really only here for you to be able to look at for reference purposes, rather than enable you to modify this directly through IronSpeed itself. But that's at the very bottom layer of this, the N tiers of your application over here on the left-hand side. Above that, we've got the data access layer code. Again, if I pop open one of the nodes here, you'll see that for every table that we've included in our application, we have a definition file and a SQL table file. I'm not going to immediately look at the code within those, but you are able to modify code directly within them. And of course, because you're operating at the data access layer rather than any higher layer of page layer, for example, any code that you were to modify here is going to apply to all accesses within that table. Above that, we've got an equivalent layer for the business logic layer, which is a very powerful location in which to insert code customizations. In each of the folders within here, we've got a folder for each of the tables that we've included in our application, and in each folder we've got the record methods and table methods that relate to each of those tables. But at the top layer, the presentation layer, where we're dealing with the actual pages within our application, this is where the vast majority of the customizations to code that you would apply would be made. If we look here, within our presentation layer, we've obviously included the categories table from the database in our app. We've got a number of different page files over on the left there. Let's have a look at add categories. And if I select that node, you'll see obviously within my quick layout editor the usual UI presentation. Now what I've done, it's come up by default on my setting in version 11.1, which we're running at here. You may need to right click somewhere within your page and go to configure and cell editor or code. Any of these options are going to provide you with the drop down sort of pop-up window area that sits underneath the quick layout editor. And that's where we're going to be able to start to have a look at some of our code. So let's click code. Of course, mine is already showing that for me. Now, depending on which area of the quick layout editor which I select, like many other features within Designer, the code tabs, which sit at the bottom, which we're going to look at now, are entirely context sensitive. So depending on where you click around on your page, you'll see that the content of that bottom window is changing dynamically to automatically reflect the code methods which might be associated with the controls or areas of the page that I'm clicking above. In this case, I've clicked the Categories Record Control page. And down here, you'll see my Code tab. And in my Code tab, I've got two different sections. On the left, I've got a number of different code methods which I can click through. And when I click those, you'll see that in the window on the right, the code will change to reflect and show me, and effectively reveal me the method that is listed in the list here on the left-hand side. Now that list on the left-hand side, you might wonder, well, why is that not listed alphabetically? And there is a very good reason for that. The methods that are listed in there, of course, they will change depending on which control or area of the page you've selected, but those methods are broadly listed to show you the order in which they will execute in the standard life cycle of the page running. So in this case, for the categories record control, this is an add page that we're dealing with. The first method is the initialization of that categories record control. Then we're going to load the control. Then we're going to load data into the control. And as you click through here, you can obviously, or hopefully you'll get a bit of an understanding of the order in which these would operate. Now that effectively would, the page loading would take me right up to something called the data bind method. The data bind is where data that's been pulled from the database will be bound to controls that will then render on the screen. The methods which are listed after this effectively are not immediately part of the life cycle of the page on load, because they would be dealing with the other end of page interaction where we're trying to commit data back to the database. So we've got a top level save data method, and then within there we have the validation or any validation code which relates to controls within that record. We're going to pull the UI data from the controls which are on it or sit within that record control and pull them into our memory and before we commit them to the table. And then finally there's a pre-render control before the page is going to post back again. So click around that page. Let's go to a different area within here. If we go to our fields section, and if we click the category name, so this is now one of the fields that sits within the category. Of course, the methods which are listed over here on the left are completely different. Now we've got the set method, so that's where we've pulled our category name from SQL, or from our database, and we're going to be writing it onto the page. We have a get method. That's if we were pulling our UI data from the page in an attempt to go and commit it back to SQL. And then we've got the validate method. That would run on any of the UI values that we pulled back in. We've also got a text change method that we can implement, such that this controls a text box, such that if anyone were typing text directly into there, we can intercept the event of the text content of that text box changing and run some custom code there. Okay, so you might immediately think, well, it seems like there's an awful lot of methods on the left there. This is a bit of a minefield. How am I ever going to know what I'm trying to modify in terms of customization to achieve my end result? The designer can do more to help you with that under the code docs section, which we'll look at now. So if we click on the code docs, you'll get a pop-up code documentation viewer displayed. This is a really good place to start when you're beginning to try to understand the nature of the .NET page lifecycle and how your page, in terms of its construction, is fitted together with all those different methods, the order in which they run, and what their various methods, or what the methods within them are attempting to achieve. So there's some really useful documentation here, and one of the great things that Designer does is automatically effectively change and perform some substitution on this documentation to make it relevant to the content that you were looking at when you clicked the button. So for example, we know that we were looking at the Add Categories page over there on the left. When this window's popped up, you'll see that it's talking about the methods or the functions which exist within the Add Categories page class. And as I click through here, this documentation on the left will change to reflect that content as we look. Now, there's an awful lot to learn here. Ironspeed's focus or the purpose of Designer is clearly not to teach you everything there might be to know about the .NET page lifecycle. But at the point that you begin to start customizing code underneath your application, it is good to have a bit of a read through here, particularly for different page types, and begin to get a little bit of an understanding of the order in which those methods run and what each of them is trying to perform. Let's have a look now, though, at the code files that sit behind each of the pages in your application and understand a little bit about how they fit together, because then we're going to be able to see how the code tabs can really help us to do the work that we want them to do. In our Add Categories page, if I pop open the node to the left of the page, you'll see that there are two other files listed there. In this case, I'm using C# as my application code language rather than VB. And underneath there, I've got two files: an Add Categories ASPX.cs file, and then another Add Categories, but in this case it's a .control.cs file. Now both of these are partial classes. In effect, they combine together to create all of the code that is required to run our Add Categories .aspx page. But the key difference between them is that the .aspx.cs file contains methods and classes which relate to the page, and the controls file, perhaps unsurprisingly, relates to or controls the code relating to methods for the various controls on the page rather than the page itself. Okay? Now, within each of these, something that comes up quite regularly when people talk about code generator tools and how those tools can help you to modify code, people talk about losing changes and how these products can ensure that code customizations that you make don't get overwritten by the tool. Now, Designer does that in a very clever way by using two different versions of each class, a base method and then an override method. And the override methods are always written into section 1 of the code and are never ever overwritten by Designer. Whereas the base methods sit inside of section 2, and within section 2 those methods will be regenerated as you make changes through the IDE of the tool. So if you look down here, you can see we've got a region showing in our code called section 1, place your customizations here. And if I collapse that up, there's another similar section immediately afterwards, section 2, do not modify this section. So immediately looking in here, you'll see all of the classes that exist down here are prefixed with base. Okay, and all of the methods that exist within section 1 are not. Now if I pop section 1 over at this point where we've made no modifications or any customizations to our code, you'll see that the first class that is in here, the categories record control, inherits from base categories record control, but the class itself is completely empty. There's nothing in it. And it's generated that way intentionally because we need that empty class, because if we were going to make customizations, that's where we would want to put them. You must never override or modify code. The designer's not going to stop you doing it. The IDE will not stop you from overwriting manually code that's in section 2. Do be aware when and if you do that, the next time you rebuild your application, Designer will overwrite the changes. But crucially, anything that you write here in section 1, Designer will never ever replace. So you will not lose your changes, regardless of whether they work or not. They're going to stay there. Okay? Now, of course, we know that within the categories record control, there are a number of different fields on the page. We know, for example, that there were various methods relating to the record control itself, such as the data bind and the validate methods. So those methods are there. If you wanted to write code to override them at this point, you could, but of course that's going to be quite tricky. You're going to have to remember the syntax of the various methods. It's a pretty hard way to go about trying to modify that method or any of those methods just by simply typing code directly into here. Nothing to stop you doing that though, of course. But Designer makes this all a great deal easier for us. So let's see how we can do that and how that would fit together. So if I click on the category name field, for example, down here I've got all of the different methods relating to the category name field. And let's say that rather, in this case, being the set method, This is the code which is pulling the value from SQL and writing that value directly onto the screen. Now let's say, for example, that we knew that every time anyone went to add a category, we wanted that name to be James, as an example. Now there's a section of code that you can see here. In this case, we're running an if statement that says, as long as the data source isn't null and the category name is specified in here, then I'm going to use the formatted value. Now this being an add page, the reality is that category name might already exist in the database. So down here, we've got an else, and clearly we can see from the comments, if the category name is null in the database, use the default value. Now I could override this very easily and just say, James, like that. Now, what you can see immediately, that within the view here in the list of the methods on the left, the set method is now showing in bold text. And that immediately tells you that there's an override relating to that method. And if you click on it, you can see our code, of course. Further down here, we've got the fact that the text equals James, as we did. Let's pop over to the code file here. And if you remember, our categories record control class in section 1 was intentionally empty. But now, when we look in it, we have a new method, an override method for set category name. And there's our code. Now, of course, I didn't type all of this method in. All I did was move directly to the area that I wanted to modify, and I typed in the James literal. Designer has then copied the base method of set category name up from section 2 into section 1, where it will never be overwritten, and written all that code in there for us and applied our customization, which makes life a great deal easier. In effect, we could modify the vast majority of the code that we might want to modify relating to more common methods within this particular page, for example, without ever needing to come to these files. And that's what the code tab is for, and it's extremely good at enabling you to do that. In addition, we may decide when we get to this point, oh, this is just a disaster. You know, we've made a complete mess of the syntax of our code, and we want to let go of it. We're not interested in it. We want to make a correction to it. We can simply use this restore button. And this says, okay, we know that we've copied up this override method, let's restore it back. Designer's going to ask us, are you sure you want to remove your customization? We say yes. The bold text over here is gone. If I scroll down now, you'll see that the literal that I've valued of James that I put in there is gone. And if we now go back to our controls file here, you'll see that in our section 1 at the top, the categories record control class is once again empty. So at those early stages when you first start to perform some modifications to your code, I would always recommend that you begin by using the code tabs. They will help you to copy those relevant methods up from section 2 into section 1 automatically, and you'll find it a great deal easier to see what you have modified and what you haven't. It's a very sensible way to go about beginning your customizations. In addition, though, before you even get to the stage possibly where you're looking at the code tabs and making use of them, there is another feature within Designer called the Code Customization Wizard, which contains a reasonable number of the commonly used overrides and modifications that people would tend to apply within an application. Now, I mention those for two different reasons. The first one is that if you're thinking of a particular customization that you might need to apply to a page or to an application, the likelihood is that someone has probably applied something similar previously, and as a consequence, it may well be that if you look in the Code Customization Wizard, or CCW as it's the acronym is often referred to in the forum, you may well look in the CCW and find that the methods, the override that you're looking for has already been written. And if that's true, then clearly your life is going to be made a great deal easier. Designers are going to be able to do the bulk of working that code out for you automatically, which is fantastic. But, and this is a big but, and a very relevant one, it may well be that you look in the Code Customization Wizard and there isn't a method in there which is entirely what you're looking for in your customization. at the early stages of learning to apply code customization, I would strongly recommend that even if that's true, you start with that code customization. So get Designer to do the work for you. That's where you're looking to get your ROI from the product. Let Designer use its tools to put the particular overrides in that may be close to what you're looking for, but maybe not entirely what you're looking for, and then modify that yourself. But always start with the code customization wizard as the first port of call. Chances are there's something either precisely what you're looking for, or if not precisely, then close. So the code customization wizard is under your tools menu. You can find it here. Oh, we need to make a run before we run. The reason that that's the case is that the code base, we may have made modifications as a result of the change that we made within the UI of the product, which will impact the code underneath our controls and pages. And if that were true, then in effect applying our CCW customization directly into our code might be incorrect, because the base code is going to change as a result of what we've been working in the UI. So here's our code customization wizard. Designer's quickly gone away and just made sure that any of the changes that we've made through the UI have been reflected in our code before it starts to customize it. We click next, and we'll get a long list. I'm just going to move this up here so you can see how many of these there are. There are a good number. And in the left-hand side, we have all of the different a tree view control showing us all the different kinds of customizations which are available. In the right-hand side, you'll see we've got a description tab, which just describes what any of these customizations are going to do for us. And then in the right-hand side, to the right of this, we've also got a preview, which shows us what the code is going to look like to achieve that override. So we've got things like, in fact, I will just expand this slightly further so we can get a better view of the descriptions. Redirect to another page when the show or the edit cannot load data. Now, that sounds like a pretty obvious thing, but clearly is going to require a code customization to achieve it. If you look in the right-hand side here, this is the code that is going to be applied. So we're going to override the load data method, and it's pretty simple. We run the base of load data, and if the data source we get back is null, then we're going to redirect our page somewhere else. Now, it may well be that you have a customization you want to apply that's similar to that one, maybe not the same. So hopefully you can see that this is going to be a good way to go about as a starting point before you start to modify that data. If you whip back to description, the other useful thing here is Designer tells you where it's going to add that code. So part of the tricky part of beginning to do your code customization is not just knowing what code to write, but where to put that code and which method to override. So I would strongly recommend you work your way through this list. There are a lot of common customizations in there. Some of them will take you through the configure step, because in order to apply that code, Designer needs to know a little bit more about the controls that you might be applying the methods to. So they might be specific to a particular field on your page, for example. That configure step, Designer might ask you there, well, which field would you like to apply this to, etc. But ultimately, you'll end up with the code that's being shown to you in this preview window, with the substitutions relating to the specific controls on your page copied into the correct location within the page that you've applied it to, and then you can go further from there to apply further customization to your code. So I would thoroughly recommend that you make use of the CCW. Together with the CCW, or Code Customization Wizard, and the code tabs, that really is the basics of the beginnings of code customization. The one thing that I would also add to that, and this is a rule of thumb which we tend to use within House of Yellow for simple customization work, we apply what we know, we think about as the 10-line rule. And that simply means that when you're applying, assuming that you're working at a fairly basic level, if you're writing code to customize a particular method, you shouldn't really ask any questions to yourself necessarily about whether this might be the right place to do it. until you go beyond 10 lines of code. If the code that you're writing begins to become very complex, and you know that you've exceeded, written vastly more than 10 lines of code to try to achieve your method, it could well be that you're writing your code in your wrong place. Because of the structure of the designer-generated methods, because they are so well structured, and because they reflect the .NET page lifecycle as well, if you're writing your customization in the correct place, you shouldn't really have to write a great deal of code for most simple customizations. And if you look within the methods in those preview windows in the code customization wizard, you'll probably see that evidenced in there. The vast majority of them will be able to achieve something sort of moderate substance with comparatively little coding. So I would encourage you to have that in the back of your mind. Once you start getting well beyond 10 lines of code, just ask the question about whether you're writing your code in the correct place. So that's the end of this video. I hope you found it useful. There are clearly more videos available online in terms of to teach you more about things like how to use Visual Studio to further customize your code within your IronSpeed apps. Thanks for watching.